of journalism in our democracy. Before we begin, I would like to recognize the team at Mississippi Today for organizing today's amazing event, and to give special thanks to our sponsors, the Mississippi Humanities Council, the Mississippi Museum of Art, and the law firm of Bradley Aaron. If you're on social media, feel free to post about this panel using the hashtag MSPPP. The American Journalism Project is a new venture philanthropy fund that exists because the civic function journalism provides is under serious threat. Our approach at AJP to solving our nation's local news crisis is based on three interlocking beliefs. Democracy and journalism are interdependent. Local news is a public good that markets won't supply. This is a we, the people, problem to solve. We are so pleased and humbled to have chosen Mississippi Today to be in our first cohort of grantees, and deeply appreciate the commitment demonstrated in today's event to strengthening civic engagement in the community at large through the power of the Fourth Estate. And now a bit about our moderator and panelists. Brian Al Naim, a native of University City, Missouri, oversees the Mississippi Today newsroom and works with the editorial team to make sure they're fulfilling their mission of producing high-quality journalism in the public interest. Brian has been with Mississippi Today since February 2016 and is an original member of the editorial team. He became news editor in August 2016 and editor-in-chief in May of 2017. Patrice Hardy is the executive editor of the Greenville News and the South Regional Editor for USA Today Network, overseeing news organizations in South Carolina, North Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Virginia. Previously, Patrice worked at the Virginia Pilot for 20 years, where she started as an intern and left as the managing editor. Patrice is a past board member of the Associated Press Media Editors and a member of the National Association of Black Journalists, where she is a former president of the Hampton Roads, Virginia chapter of that organization. She is also an executive board member for the South Carolina Press Association and a recent graduate of Furman University's Diversity Leadership Institute. Curtis Wilkie, nationally known journalist and author, is the inaugural fellow of the Overby Center for Southern Journalism and Politics. His work as a political writer for the Boston Globe has been recognized around the world. Wilkie is a native of Greenville, Mississippi, and graduated from Ole Miss in 1963. Wilkie was a reporter and editor at the Clarksdale Press Register from 1963 to 1969, a time when the civil rights movement was at its height. While at the Boston Globe for 25 years, he served as national and foreign correspondent. He covered 7 presidential campaigns for the Globe and served as White House correspondent from 1977 to 1982. He established and headed the Globe's Middle East Bureau and lived in Jerusalem from 1984 to 1987. He covered numerous wars and conflict in the Middle East. He is a frequent contributor to national magazines and has written or co-written 5 books. Elise Jordan is a political analyst for NBC News and MSNBC and a contributor to Time. She was a policy advisor to Senator Rand Paul's 2016 presidential campaign. During the Bush administration, Elise worked in the White House Office of Presidential Speechwriting and at the State Department as a speechwriter and advisor to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. In 2007, she joined the National Security Council, where she worked on press and communication strategy for the administration's Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan policies. While at the White House, Elise worked for extended periods at the U.S. Embassy Baghdad and the Commanding General's Strategic Advisory Group at the International Security Assistance Force and headquarters in Kabul, Afghanistan. She was born and raised in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and is a graduate of Yale University. Elise, her husband Mike Hogan, and her corgi Bobby Sneakers live in New York City. And now I would like to turn it over to our moderator, Brian Naim.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you all for coming to the panel. Elise, you framed a lot of these, the stuff that I want to talk about today in your opening presentation. But we in the media are rightfully and finally, I think, having a conversation about misinformation and disinformation. I kind of want to start the conversation there, but also moving the conversation beyond just sort of griping about it and coming up with solutions. I want to start with you, Curtis, because we know that this didn't start with fake news and somebody's racist uncle on Facebook in 2016. you were just kind of joking in the green room about a source wanting you to inflate some numbers having to do with the protest. And so it's always been around. If you could give kind of some context about just how the issue of misinformation, disinformation have evolved, but particularly why what we're seeing now is so much more, if you agree, dangerous for our democracy.
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, Brian, I think you're right. It's always been with us, and Elise made a point when she spoke earlier. It's important that it's more important that I think you characterize it to be feared than to be loved, and I think that's a very important role that we have. We're not in the business of reporting and being journalists in order to curry favor, to make friends. We're here to try to do our work. In the context of the press and democracy, I was reminded of a famous Jefferson line as he was busy helping to form the basis for this country, and he said, given a choice between government and newspapers, I think I'd rather have newspapers. And of course, after he became president, he changed his mind. He'd been beaten up pretty badly by the partisan press, but that's one of the most essential parts of our role is, regardless, there's all sorts of disinformation. There are people who are picking at you to take sides, accept their explanations, their figures, their alleged facts, whatever. It's more intense now, I think, under Donald Trump because we come under more attack from him and his people than ever. But we've never been particularly friends with any administration. It's just more intense now. We've never been branded as enemy of the people. It's a wonderful slogan, Stalin liked, and fake news and all that stuff. But that should roll off our backs like water off the duck's back. An important thing is for us not to be intimidated, inhibited by criticism, and to do our job and do it as accurately as we possibly can.
And part of the reason we're having this conversation is we find ourselves in the midst of another presidential election. There's conflict in the Middle East. There's the impeachment trials set to begin. I wanted to circle back to your comment earlier this morning, Elise, about the need for regulation and just whether or not you've thought about like what that might look like. Would it be kind of similar to the 8 words that you can't say on the radio? These are the 8 words that you can't say on Twitter or Facebook, or how would that look?
Well, it should be online. The big tech conglomerates, Facebook, Twitter's, paid advertising should be held to the same standard as network television advertising. There are just some basic common sense shifts that I think we're going to have to do, just because you see that Facebook in particular has shown no willingness to actually address the problem. And I'll give a shout out. I'm on the advisory board for a startup called NewsGuard that is started by Gordon Krovitz and Steve Brill, who's been a great mentor of mine. And it provides an information level, much like when you're looking at you're making a food decision, it rates a news site and a news organization on the veracity of their news and of their content, and identifies any business conflicts of interest, who it's funded by. And there just are common sense approaches, I think, that as consumers we can make. And one of my observations when I've been going around the country talking to voters of all different conglomerates strikes is that people want good quality news, and they're frustrated. They're frustrated that they can't trust so much of the news that they encounter on social media, and they're looking for ways to become more sophisticated news consumers, but they aren't necessarily the news consumers that are going to be reading The Economist or publications like that. And so I think that anything that we can do to make it easier for consumers to have high quality news is also important.
Catrice, what's an editor supposed to do? Because this conversation may be a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's important to have in front of folks who may not understand how all these things work. And so, like when we're writing headlines, for example, we're trying to think about SEO and what will perform well on social media, right? But then there's a tension between that sometimes, between that and sometimes what is absolutely and perfectly accurate. And just as an editor and overseeing as many newsrooms as you do, how do you think about that tension between a desire to write a story and frame a story so that it has broad reach, but then also the responsibility news organizations have to be accurate and to get it right?
So I think any journalist is really, really concerned today about accuracy. And obviously, the first priority is, why are we writing this story? So I think if you start with quality, if what you're doing is substantive, if it's going to make an impact, if it's going to make a difference, already then I think you've said, I'm committed to making sure I tell this story correctly. The next part of that, though, is, and I can give you an example, and it's something more superficial, it's football. But we had an interview this past week with Trevor Lawrence, who's a quarterback for Clemson University, if anybody knows who that is. And the headline was basically something along the lines of trying to get you to read the story about whether Trevor was going to go pro. And so it was really, honestly, I thought it was a trick almost, what I saw when I saw them first do it. And so then we went back really quickly, because I'm like, why are we setting people up to basically have him say he's not going pro? So we changed the headline. And we were more accurate. Trevor, and I forgot what it was, but it made you read it, but it was also more accurate so that we're not tricking you to click on the story. And I think that's something that we have to, as journalists and as editors, we have to pay attention to. The other part of that also, I think, is being open with the community and with our readers about why we're doing what we're doing and how we do it. So we write a lot more stories today on how we got the story. We FOIA'd this person, we reached out to this person. The person didn't comment, but let me tell you how many times we tried to reach out to them. We emailed them, we showed up at our office, we talked to the assistant. We have to be more forthcoming with you guys about what we're doing and how we're going about it, so that you can see for yourselves the hard work it takes to put these stories together, but that we don't want to quote, the person said no comment or didn't return the phone call. We're going out of our way to try to get them to comment and give you their perspective, and we need to be open with you about how we do that.
Yeah. I mean, is distrust of media simply a function of, Russian-produced fake news articles on social media? Is it the occasional headline that we get along? Because we talk about how deep distrust is for audiences and readers of journalists, but I'm interested in hearing you all's assessments about where do you think that stems from, and again, like, what is the role of a newsroom in helping rebuild that trust? You touched on it a little bit, Catrice, in terms of transparency, but at least, do you have any?
Well, it's depressing when you look at polling that, journalists are held in as high of esteem as, members of Congress, maybe less in some polls.
Yikes.
And having worked on the Republican side of politics and understanding the right-wing media ecosystem, I don't think that some of the complaints are unfounded. You look at some of the natural inclination of plenty of journalists on the national level is to skew a little bit more to the left. And so it's a frustration for people who feel that their views aren't being accurately reflected. Now, does that mean that it should go in the complete other extreme where all news is partisan, all news is siloed off, and you have, a cable news network that is a de facto entity of a political party in a way that it wasn't during the Bush administration, I'll say. Fox News covered us more aggressive, they were more friendly, but the media environment has shifted and become arguably more politicized, and I'm just saying that, putting my political operative hat on. But I think, and I'm encouraged because consumers are aware. And I do think that if there's any aftermath of the Mueller report and of the coverage of it, anyone who read the indictment of the Russian Information Agency and the operation that they had during 2016, I mean, it reads like a good investigative deep dive in the level of detail. And it was, I worked on a Republican campaign that raised about, I think, $12 million. They spent about $10 million on this information operation. It wasn't an unsophisticated operation. And doing focus groups when we were in Wisconsin and talking to one group of African American voters, and this was in October of 2016, and hearing how, they're discussed with Hillary, which certainly plenty of it was unfounded, but we did hear mention of Facebook, referencing Facebook. And so it's what happened in the election was unfair to Donald Trump's supporters who were going to vote for him without this kind of effort. It was voter suppression when it came to suppressing the vote of communities that weren't going to vote for Donald Trump. And I think that as we are becoming more educated, consumers are becoming more informed, but we still have a long ways to go.
We're an imperfect profession, if indeed we're a profession, but I think part of the problem, and I'm old-fashioned, I'm old, I go back to hot type stuff in the newspaper, but I think part of our problem over the last 15 or 20 years, dare I say it, in the forum sponsored by Mississippi Today, but so much of the problem arose from internet and not from a good legitimate news organization like Mississippi Today or Politico or Texas Tribune. I think Andy's been one of your models. Really outstanding stuff, but there is so much stuff that gets on the internet that is unfiltered that goes for news, and it is fake and it's not believable, but it passes off as news. A great example, I remember early on in the days of the internet, and my friend, the late John Siegenthaler, who had worked loyally for the Kennedy administration and had a distinguished career in journalism as publisher at the Tennessean in Nashville. The internet had him as being one of the conspirators in the murder of Robert Kennedy and perhaps John Kennedy. And that had been out there for weeks until somebody finally told John, did you know this is on the internet? It's on his description in Wikipedia, I think. He says, good God, and it was out there. And somebody trolling through it would see this. And he tried to get it corrected. He said, the problem is I've got nobody to sue. I have no recourse. So this has been a problem. There is so much crap that goes on under the guise of news on the internet. It's unfiltered, that people can write blogs, whatever. They don't know anything. It's all stuff that they make up to emphasize their points. And I think that's one of the reasons that Donald Trump can get away with branding everything he doesn't like fake news. There is a lot of fake stuff out there.
Yeah. Catrice, I'm curious about the experience of your newsrooms. As you try to be more transparent around how stories come together, what's been the reaction of readers? Do you feel like trust is growing? Do you feel like you're still kind of stuck in the same place?
I definitely think it depends on the community you're in. So I think that where I'm based in Greenville, South Carolina, we have been very persistent about it. It is part of when we talk about stories. So what story we're going to put, or what few graphs that we're going to say how we got the story. The reason I think that we're making an impact is because we have more subscribers today than we had 3 years ago when I started. And I'm talking about digital subscriptions. We're very focused on that. And one of the reasons we want to be transparent is because we want to say this is a profession. Everybody who comes in here is really serious about helping this community, and we need your support. And this is why you should pay for what we do. This is why it's stellar work. This is why it's more impactful to you. And so I think we've made some inroads there. I think in other communities, we have a long way to go. I think we haven't been that consistent about it. We have not done a good job, I think, of all the time saying what it took, how hard it was, even the adversity we face. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, so-and-so gave us this information, but this is what so-and-so says that's inaccurate about it. And I think we should say that. There's nothing wrong with that. And I also think that we kind of get into this, society is like this. Things are not black and white. That's how they're portrayed a lot of time in the media. Most things are gray, shades of gray. And we've got to do a better job, I think, of showing the community that it's really in the middle. It's not, he's right, he's wrong. There's something about the reason that these people feel this way, and there's some common ground here. We just haven't done a good job, I think, of really digging to portray that and to put that out for the community.
Yeah, as much as we journalists and folks in the media like to talk about what a crisis we're in the middle in and how local news is dying, I think there are reports that show that, average people think the media is doing just fine. Like, they don't think we're struggling at all. And so on the same token, I'm just curious, how does our industry make the case to our readers, both that we are having some problems, that we're doing our best, but also that they should support journalism in whatever form that it looks like. Because I think we get so busy reporting the news, it's the other piece of our jobs that we forget about, which is making the case for our own value to our readers and even our potential audiences.
I can say from my perspective, I think doing a better job of showing that we're everyday people. So on social, we have tried to really put out little videos on, Lily, the food writer, who's a mother of twins, who's lived in South Carolina her entire life and only wanted to do this. And this is how she supports her family. I think it's also really telling people your subscription means that the story we did last week that potentially I had one this past year, we took 3 years to report it. And it was a statewide story that had a lot of impact. But saying this is what it took. I had a regular story too that we spent $2,000 on FOIA expenses to nail it down, but it was that important because it was about EMS safety in our community. So the more we can do that, show that we're people, we're human. We have to own the fact that we're human and we make mistakes, but then be bold about the fact that we made that mistake. Just as bold as the fact that when we wrote it. I think those are really important things that we have to do consistently so that people will understand, we need your support. We need you to pay for us. And yeah, we gave it to you for free in the past. We made a huge mistake as an industry by doing that, but we need your support now.
I absolutely agree on the humility point and admitting when we make mistakes because of the imperfect nature of what the job is and being in transparency with readers. I also think that the constraints of the traditional editorial opinion page model is really confusing to a lot of news consumers. And I think there needs to be more of a debate about educating consumers about this is editorial, this is opinion, this side of the newspaper, whether that means that there need to be more bylines on more opinion pieces that are the newspaper editorial pages. And it's a problem with cable news too, differentiating between whose opinion, what's hard news. I frankly think we do a pretty good job of it at MSNBC, but it can be very confusing, and it's something that you have to make a conscious effort to make clear to viewers just so they don't feel like they're getting just a heap load of bias constantly and that it's something that they can't listen to because they feel like from the get-go they aren't getting a fair shake.
I think one of the important roles that news organizations offer to the public is we are a recourse for you to come to if you've got a grievance about government or you see something that's corruption, and whether you're a whistleblower or you're an average citizen and you feel like, there's nowhere to go. So many of the great investigative stories that you read or you hear come from tips. They don't come from the stealthful work of investigative reporters. They come from average citizens who know something and they don't know where to go with it, and they take it to the news organization, and from there the news organization pursues it with their staff and dig into it. And whether it's Watergate or what's going on today, that it's the tips from average people that produce, I'll bet, 80-90% of the great investigative stories. They start with you all out there, not in our newsrooms.
Yeah, you all touched on this a little bit, but I'm really interested in the role of identity and place. The name of this panel is The Role of Journalism in Democracy, and our managing editor joked, who's democracy, right? And so my experience as a journalist in Mississippi has been very different from my experience as a journalist covering the Illinois General Assembly. And people react to me differently when I get in an Uber in Texas versus when I get into an Uber in Chicago and tell them that I'm a journalist. And so, how should we be thinking about the role of place, and then also who we are as reporters and how that shapes our coverage, how we are as editors, how that shapes coverage, and how can we use that as assets? But then, what are the tensions around maintaining objectivity and neutrality? I'm interested in hearing Catrice's thoughts on that.
Big question for me first. It's really interesting. So a lot of news organizations, no matter where you work or for what network, we have these ethical guidelines. And we prominently display those so that you understand what we're supposed to follow, and the commitment we make to you so that we are objective. But let's face it, as you said, our backgrounds, I'm a Southerner. I love the South. I'm from Louisiana. I love LSU. So those things are going to come into play. For example, this week when I've been overseeing coverage from LSU and Clemson, it's like, well, guys, I'm for LSU. Let me just tell you that. So make sure this coverage is on both sides. So I think that we have to just be open and transparent about that. The other part of that, though, is, we have, at the USA Today Network, we have several ethical directors who I go to all the time for advice. I can give you an example of a story last week where we had written about a police chief in one of the towns that we cover who had lost his job, and one of the reasons he lost a job was because he did not tell the truth about getting off a high-profile hoteler in town. So of course we did the investigative work to find out who this hotel owner was, and so then the question was, is it fair, because this guy had a public drunkenness charge, is it really fair to write a story about who it was when it was really just a misdemeanor? And so I called several ethical directors for guidance on that. And so we ultimately wrote the story, but we wrote it in the vein of, this is the reason the police chief lost his job. I don't think we would have written it had we not done that. And we said to the community, this is why we're telling you who this is. So those are all, I think, really important factors that I think we then need to say, we wrestle with these things. We lose sleep over these things all the time. I know I do. I know everybody on this panel who's been involved in high impact work has. And so I think it's important for us to be able to say that to you. We know we're imperfect. We know that our own backgrounds play a part in what we write and how we approach them, but that's why we have a group of people who look like me, you, and everybody else in this room who are having those conversations every day, so that it's not just me making the decision, but it's people from different backgrounds who can offer their input on that.
Yeah, I didn't want to get all cheesy and say diversity is a strength, but I think we're just starting to make an argument to readers that's okay, man. It's okay for me to be transparent about the fact that my worldview is shaped by who I am, and the worldview of our other reporters and editors are also shaped by who they are. And really the strength in our journalism, I didn't mean to start preaching, is in getting those people in a room together and making decisions about coverage that will serve our community. But something that I hear a lot is that, you're a conservative state, so you all need to be more conservative. And like, I actually don't have anything to offer to that. I think we try. What is that? I mean, because as you were talking about like your affiliation with MSNBC and how people perceive it, because you said it, people are going to say that MSNBC said it, even if it was an opinion, right? So like, how should we be talking to readers about the kind of transparency and conversations that we're having within our organizations about leveraging the diversity in our newsrooms and how that's affecting coverage, but also how that is not the thing that makes us biased.
Well, I think it comes down to what you were talking about, having so many different voices in the newsroom and how it contributes to the decisions that you end up making. When you're putting together an opinion show and you're having a panel, having those voices represented. And I think that it's something that overall in the media, you're seeing we're doing better, but we still have so far to go. But some of the best debates that I have heard on cable news have been when we had a good friend of mine, Eddie Glaude, who's from Moss Point, Mississippi, and then he was debating Noah Rothman, who's a writer for commentary, and they were having a debate about identity politics, and both coming from different places but respectfully debating the role and how much of a voice identity politics should be in American politics. And so I think that anything we can do to talk about these issues and hash it out on the public stage, it increases public understanding, and it also lets viewers understand the complexity of grappling with these issues, that it's not black and white, that these issues are not clear cut. And so we're doing, going forward, it needs to be, an ongoing emphasis, but it's not something that I see an easy or quick fix when it is a nuanced problem.
And I think, and Ryan, I don't know about your newsroom, but I know this most recent political cycles and elections, we had a lot of journalists who, for instance, wanted to go to the Women's March and who wanted to show their support for candidate X or Y, and then sometimes they would just on their own personal social pages maybe push some certain stories that always leaned in one direction. And so and here's the thing, yes, they are human, yes, they have their own viewpoints, but they represent us by nature of what they do. And so we've had a lot of conversations about, in today's time, how difficult it is for many journalists to not offer their input and to stay away from the women's movement and all the things that they value and believe in because of how that looks to the community. And so that has been very difficult, I think, especially for the younger journalists who are used to being able to say what they believe and put out there what they want. I mean, it's the most interesting time, I think, to be a journalist, because we have clear viewpoints based on the research we've done on how we feel about certain issues and our compassion for the community, but we have to be very careful about how we portray that.
I think we're going to go to questions, but I have one last question that I want to give each of you an opportunity to answer. Just about, like, what are you excited about in the coming year with respect to media and journalism? Where do you think the opportunities are that we can really, sort of move forward as an industry and develop solutions to the challenges that we've all been sort of grappling with in the last few years?
I think one of the most important things we need to do, not just here in an election year, but and we've already alluded to it, is make a strong distinction between what is editorial and an opinion and what is news. And sometimes that gets blurred, and sometimes we suffer from it because it is partisan or weighted one way or another, and people say, well, they're a liberal rag, or they're a right-wing mouthpiece to the administration, and can't be believed. I think it's really important to have a strong distinction. We used to call it separation of church and state.
I think for me it would be authentic storytelling. So I think you guys have been writing a lot here about the prison situation. Alabama has the same issue as well. And I think an example of that, and I think some of the conversation this morning was about poverty, just putting a camera in front of a person who's living in these situations and just letting that person, through their own story, talk to your readers about what they're experiencing. That's not my viewpoint. That's not your viewpoint. That's the life of person X. And so I think we have a wonderful opportunity, because it's not that, TV used to be the camera site and newsprint was just in the newspaper, and then we might have had a couple of photos. If we can do this authentically using the internet, which is a wonderful tool for that, and just offer you those insights, I think it's a wonderful opportunity with the election season to do that, to go all over this country and show people what people are experiencing when it comes to any number of issues, including global warming and climate change.
I really think it's a golden age for journalism right now, and if there's one complaint I have, it's just that there is so much to cover right now that it's hard to digest it all, and it makes my head spin. But just this week we have potential new war, we have the presidential Democratic nomination fight, we have impeachment, and that's not even getting into all of the local stories that we could focus and hone in on domestically within the U.S. And so I think that pacing ourselves, but you look at the incredible work. I joke that Morning Joe kind of introduces the day and talk about, what's coming ahead. And, sometimes it's the president's witching hour to tweet. So he tweets a lot in the morning, but we don't really cover the tweets like we used to. But then I frequently on the 4 p.m. show. And by 4 p.m., the day can be completely different, and that, we say, is the witching hour for a lot of the major print journalists to drop huge, huge stories. And my friend Nicole Wallace, you just see her, ripping up a script and going, we're all just reading what, incredible new journalism has broken by our colleagues and trying to respond in the minute. So it really is drinking from a water hose, and that's what I worry about for consumers too, because how do you, if I have such a problem keeping up, how do we expect everyone, the more casual reader, to stay engaged?
Indeed. So what do you all want to know?
Continue to open the door with this question, and I'd like Curtis to draw on his experience as sports editor of the Bulldogs Bar and give us his opinion of the Monday night game.
Charlie and I went to high school together many, many years ago.
It's my fault.
Now you got to answer the question.
What was your question? Believe it or not, the Ole Miss guy is going to be pulling like hell for LSU.
I'm stunned.
Coach O, go on.
Good morning. I'm Angela Wade, Mississippi Center for Justice. As I listened to the panel this morning, and of course, Elise earlier, we talked about disinformation or misinformation in the news, and we were speaking about it as it relates to United States, Silicon Valley, Facebook, Twitter. But do you think, or are you seeing that this is a phenomenon across the world, as it, whether it's Europe, whether it's South America, and it seems from some reports that it's generated either by Russians wanting to influence politics or government, and or to create a surge in, whether it's hate or anti-immigration. So can you speak to that, where this is not just an issue that we're dealing with here in the United States, but something that's much larger? And then as you speak to it, if you can give any insight on, I guess, how we are to address that, and particularly from the news standpoint or reporting standpoint.
Well, it's definitely global. the misinformation wars that are happening right now. It's just such a cheap, asymmetric method of targeting, influencing populations, of weakening, classic geopolitical competition. You look at in the run-up to the Brexit vote, the Russians were active there. We know more, people are more aware of Russian activity, but the North Koreans are there, the Chinese are there, a lot of non-friendly and even friendly competitors on the world stage. You look though in terms of public policy, and Europe has definitely done more in terms of how they are approaching misinformation and regulation of tech. And there are pros and cons to that, but they certainly are being much more proactive. And you look at how within our own country, we've even had resistance towards the security of the next election, just because it's become so politicized when it really is a basic national security question at this stage.
I'm Wyatt Emmerich. I'm involved in the community newspaper business in the state. There's a huge issue that nobody seems to address regarding fake news and social media, and that is the Communications Decency Act of 1996 exempted Facebook and social media from the 400-year-old common law libel and slander laws in this country, which allows the phenomenon of fake news to occur because there's nobody with a deep pocket to sue. Why can't we as an industry focus on that issue? It's a horrible protectionist exemption for big tech that has destroyed our industry. And I'm just wondering, why have we not as an industry raised awareness to this absurd exemption that has destroyed our industry?
I've been retired for 20 years. They're going to handle this one.
So also, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. What I can tell you is that I think that we've all been wrestling in our industry with how to go about this. And so one of the things I think that we as an industry made a mistake of is, do you remember back when newspapers first got on the internet and we had commenting on our stories? And we became a forum for folks to be, readers to be able to get in there and express their viewpoints. And then we started saying, oh, well, should we make sure so-and-so doesn't call so-and-so a bad name? And then we tried to figure out how we should review what they were saying and maybe remove people's rights to say things because they were being obnoxious. And then we just walked away from it. And then Facebook came and Twitter came. And so I think that I think we as an industry own the fact that we are part of the problem and we allowed this to happen. We just walked away and threw our hands in the air. USA Today Network is actually trying to sample a new avenue to take back some of that commenting on our sites, but obviously that's problematic right now. And so we're doing some different tests in different news organizations. Greenville, South Carolina, where I am, is starting to do that. We're really doing some surveys with the community about what they'd like to see, how we should go about it. But it's a huge problem, and we should pay more attention to that. But I do wonder, though, even if we did today, is it too late?
In your conversation, you spoke a lot about accuracy. And for me, the issue is not accuracy, and I wanted your opinion on something. It seems like, in addition to being accurate, a lot of outlets have adopted other standards of journalism, being controversial and sensitive and those kinds of things that stir emotion. So as a result, you get information that is true, that does more to polarize a community than it does to educate a community. So I was interested in your views of that.
Oh, do I get to answer a question? I mean, you're right. Again, going back to the conversation about the role of technology and social media, I mean, we're always thinking in terms of how our stories will be best rewarded on social media and on the internet. And, a lot of times that is the more inflammatory language. But, you know, we're always thinking through, like, what is the line there? You know, how can we encourage people to read a story and use strong, compelling language without being incendiary or alarmist? And, you know, those are just, like, often conversations that involve very large groups of people. It's not just me making those decisions. It's not just the editors making decisions. You know, often there are times where, you know, we're writing about subjects where neither myself nor our managing editor has a lot of expertise, and there may be expertise in the newsroom. And, you know, yeah, I'm going to go out into the newsroom and get a group of people together who are smart and who can help us figure out those kinds of issues, so that we know that when we hit publish on a story, that it's you know, that it's accurate, that it's truthful, and something that's in the public interest, which is ultimately what our mission is at Mississippi Today.
Hi, my name is Cameron Thomas. Patrice kind of touched on this earlier, but I just wanted to ask, in this big era of fake news, since this is the hot topic of this panel, I wanted to talk about, like, not so much about editorials, but more so of, like, who writes the stories and taking your personal experiences into consideration and how you write a story rather than putting your own personal opinion into it. So I wanted to ask, like, your opinion about, like, how should we as journalists use our own personal experiences and in a way that to write a story in the best way that we can while maintaining pure objectivity.
So I think from my perspective, it's having reporters and editors having great conversations about those experiences before you approach a story. So the relationship you two have is really, really important. So saying, I might be writing a story about X, but I need you to understand that this is experience I had as well. So having that open dialogue will mean that your editor is more sensitive to words that you potentially might use that might give off a certain opinion about how you view something. A recent story we had earlier last year, it was very clear that the writers who wrote it, and there were several, had a clear viewpoint about marijuana. It was just obvious. And so when I was reading the story, and it was something they'd worked on for a long time, I remember thinking, okay, we need to kind of maybe tone down some of the language, because their viewpoints, it was very obvious where they stood and how, you know, if so-and-so got arrested for this, what's the big deal? That's kind of how it came across. And that, hey, I get it, but we just can't have that impression about the story. And so I think that's why you have multiple people reading stories. That's why you share those experiences. But words, every single word matters. And in the age of rushing to get something first, sometimes that is sacrifice. And we have to be really, really dogged about that, especially with sensitive stories.
Yeah, I think it's important that you use, you know, whatever education you have about the issue that you're covering and to draw upon your experience. That's far more important than your opinion. The problem is we all have opinions, and it's, you know, I think we have to try our best to submerge the opinion in writing or reporting the story, but it's there, and sometimes you have to kind of beat it down yourself to keep it from kind of invading the story you're writing. It's a problem any reporter has, is wrestling with an opinion.
At the risk of sounding sophomoric, I'll ask you anyway. Where's the clearinghouse with this internet business? I mean, I know your professional ethics perhaps don't allow you to call out a publication, but if I'm reading what comes across the internet, which one do I know is worth listening to and which is not? And I think people who are sitting out there in the hinterland they're not distinguishing what's on the up and up and what's not. So how do you police your profession? Make each other accountable.
You know, at the risk of plugging a product that I'm on the board for, but I should believe in it if I'm on the board, and I do really, you can download the NewsGuard browser, and it will have, you know, it starts like on your Twitter feed, and it'll be a green, this is a verified news source that passes a certain level of standards. You know, like they have seen the newsroom that they've set up at NewsGuard. If a publication gets a questionable rating, they call it looks like it's going to happen that way. They call the publication, ask the questions, and they're seeing those editors try to address with more transparency the issues at hand. And it's one solution among many, but I think that news outlets are trying to be more transparent about article bylines, about editors. You see a lot of long form pieces now include who edited the story. Just general transparency is so important in the industry.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we need to get y'all to lunch.
So, Elise mentioned earlier, you talked about how there is a desire to be better consumers of news. And I see that is true amongst a lot of folks. Not so much for my family in the Pine Belt, right? Who are so afraid of what they've been fed over the past 4 years plus. And now we're getting their news from Breitbart or the Daily Stormer. That there's, not only is there no appetite for a better, to be better consumers of news, but there's a real fear of it. So, and you know, that's a large part of the population. So is there a way that I mean, what do you do with those people who've gotten so far off in that corner of the internet that, you know, and it's not like it's a few folks anymore.
Ooh, I don't have any easy answer for that. I think that in terms of the industry, you see there are a lot of beats focusing now on disinformation, on the conspiracy theory web, you know, it's become a beat. And I think that is the best way that using journalism, using facts to help dispel what's happening and just the big business behind it. And you know, recently I was very encouraged that the Sandy Hook parents were able to sue Alex Jones, and that they are, you know, meeting success for the emotional impact of what he has, the distress he's caused by blatant, harmful, emotionally traumatic, you know, doing it just for his own industrial complex down in Austin, selling, you know, pills to defluoride your water so you don't turn into a fish. So I have no easy answer, though, for when someone goes so deep in that world. Though there was a really good BuzzFeed deep dive of a reporter who kind of went in that white supremacy land and then realized it and turned back, and it was just, for your personal interest, I would check it out.
Okay, so I want to thank our panelists for a very lively discussion.